Hello, you've joined the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board's, or CSB's, public business meeting. We will now begin this meeting with Steve Owens, the chairperson of the CSB.
Well, thank you, Brian, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Owens, as Brian said. I'm the chairperson of the Chemical Safety Board. Welcome to our first public meeting of 2024. 2023 was a very busy year for the CSB. Not only did we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the CSB, but we made substantial progress in moving this agency forward and building and revitalizing the CSB. And as I hope as many of you already know, we completely eliminated the enormous backlog in investigation reports that had plagued the CSB for so many years. When I became the interim executive of the CSB in late July 2022, after the former chairperson resigned, the CSB had an unacceptable backlog of 17 open investigations that had accumulated under prior agency leadership. Some were dating as far back as 2016. But the CSB team worked incredibly hard. And between late July 2022 and the end of December last year, we issued final reports for all 17 investigations in the backlog. We released the last report in the backlog on December 26th of last year. The 17 final investigation reports issued from July 29, 2022 through December 26, 2023 are the most reports that the CSB has ever issued in such a short period, and they represent the CSB's highest level of productivity in the agency's history. A chart listing the 17 reports and the date on which each was issued is posted on the CSB's website, if you want to go look at that. This is a remarkable achievement, and we are very proud of what we have done. But we are also very determined that the CSB never have to do something like this again. Eliminating the backlog took an extraordinary effort by every single employee at the CSB, working together as a team. Board members Sylvia Johnson and Kathy Sandoval and I are extremely grateful to the CSB's career staff for all their hard work and their dedication and commitment to the CSB and its mission. Along with eliminating the longstanding report backlog, we also have made great progress improving employee morale at the CSB, and I'm very pleased to report that the CSB achieved the largest gains among very small federal agencies in 3 key areas in the most recent Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, according to the Office of Personnel Management. While previous year's surveys revealed very low morale at the CSB under prior agency leadership, this year's results showed substantial improvement. The CSB finished with a 29% positive increase in employee engagement, a 28% increase in global satisfaction, and a 13% increase in performance confidence. So things are looking up at the CSB. During today's meeting, we will hear presentations from CSB investigation staff about the final 5 investigation reports that we issued last year to eliminate the backlog. They are Yankton Majestic in Columbus, Ohio, Gideon Milling in Cambria, Wisconsin, Foundation Food Group in Gainesville, Georgia, Kimco in Crosby, Texas, and the Windland 1H well in Burleson County, Texas. But before I turn the floor over to my fellow board members for their remarks, I want to address one bit of housekeeping, as we do at every one of these meetings. At the end of today's presentations, we will provide an opportunity for public comments. Of time, we ask that you please keep your comments to 3 minutes, and please use the icon on your screen to raise your hand so that you can be recognized to speak. If you'd prefer to submit written comments, you can do so by sending them to public@csb.gov. That's public, PUBLIC, @csb.gov. Now I'd like to turn this over to board member Sylvia Johnson for her remarks, and then to board member Kathy Sandoval. Sylvia, please go ahead, and then Kathy, please do so as well when Sylvia's concluded. And thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first quarterly board meeting of calendar year 2024. I'd like to open my comments by echoing the sentiments of the chairperson and express my gratitude and congratulations to the entire staff of the CSB for clearing out the longstanding backlog. As you just heard, in 17 short months, we've eliminated this longstanding backlog, and this would not have been possible without every single person at the CSB. In addition to the investigations team, our recommendations, contracting, board affairs, IT, human resources, finance, public affairs, and the Office of General Counsel all played a pivotal role in getting us to this point. I'd also like to thank my board colleagues, Steve, for your great leadership, and Kathy for your enthusiasm and hard work. From day one, you joined me and Steve and worked collaboratively with us to move this agency forward. So thank you for that. When we started down this road and put out this ambitious schedule, we knew it wouldn't be easy and we had our doubters. But again, thanks to the hard work and dedication of this entire team, not only is the backlog done, but we're well positioned to prevent a backlog from occurring anytime in the foreseeable future. When Steve and I joined the CSB almost 2 years ago, one of the things that we both felt strongly about was stakeholder engagement. And I can say that we have not wavered from that. In November of 23, I had the opportunity to speak at the AFL-CIO's Health and Safety Committee's virtual meeting. There were several unions participating in that meeting, and they represented a broad spectrum of workers ranging from manufacturing to nursing to public sector employees, transportation, educators, and beyond. And this meeting represented yet another opportunity for the CSB to share our efforts to rebuild and revitalize this agency. As Steve mentioned earlier, we've hired some new staff since our last board meeting, and I'd like to welcome them. I'm thrilled that you chose to join this great team of dedicated public servants who work tirelessly to protect the health and safety of workers, communities, and the environment. It's an exciting time to be at the CSB, and as we grow and expand, we're now in position to meet and execute the mission of this great agency. Again, welcome to the meeting, and I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
So thank you, Sylvia, Dr. Johnson. And special thanks to all of the CSB staff and to my fellow board members for your hard work, dedication, expertise, collegiality, and commitment to the CSB's work. This mission is critical to the health and welfare of the United States, and also provides information that educates people around the world as the world manages chemical safety issues. So it is a huge accomplishment to eliminate the backlog, and so important to also bring forward the recommendations and the analysis about why these incidents happened, and to highlight the recommendations to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. As you will hear from the reports that we look forward to today, sadly, these incidents represent collectively more than a dozen fatalities, more than 4 dozen serious injuries, each of them a tragedy. These reports and recommendations seek to prevent such harms to workers in the future and to communities and the environment. You'll hear safety issues, many of which are familiar, some of which are new shades on familiar problems, including combustible dust management, poor hazard analysis, poor safety training and communications, failure to use the hierarchy of controls to create safety by design, poor corporate culture that also normalized undue risk. So we have an opportunity not only to provide sincere condolences to the families and communities affected by each of these terrible incidents, but also to take up the recommendations to ensure that such incidents will not continue to reoccur. And indeed, that will be one of the next steps the CSB is engaged in, is monitoring the recommendation recipients and their progress in implementing each of these recommendations to ensure that we will prevent chemical fatalities and injuries and promote worker, community, and environmental safety. So I really thank everybody at the CSB for their dedication to this mission. And we are also grateful to everyone who participated in the investigation report and recommendation process, and also are very thankful to the public for the opportunity to engage with you to promote chemical and worker and community and environmental safety. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing more about the reports.
Great. Well, thank you, Jill, and thank you, Kay, for those terrific remarks. Now I'd like to turn things over to Steve Kleist, who's our Executive Director of Investigations and Recommendations, to lead us through the presentations on the reports that were concluded last year.
Thank you, Steve. On behalf of the career staff, I would like to thank you, as well as board members Johnson and Sandoval, for your support that allowed us to achieve this outstanding accomplishment. We very much appreciate it. We'll be covering 5 investigations that were closed and adopted by the board in the last quarter of calendar year 2023. The first presentation will cover the Yankton Majestic investigation, and making those presentations this afternoon will be the investigator in charge, Melike Ursus, and chemical incident investigator, Marianne Bogutsky. So Melike, please proceed.
Good afternoon. I, along with my teammate Marianne Bogutsky, will be presenting findings and recommendations from the CSB's investigation of the fatal vessel leak, vapor cloud explosion, and fire at the Yankton Majestic resin plant in Columbus, Ohio. Next slide, please. This is actually the wrong slide. Okay, this one. Next slide, please. Okay, this incident took place shortly after midnight on April 8th, 2021. The explosion shook nearby homes and was seen, heard, or felt throughout parts of Columbus. Of the 21 employees present, 1 employee was fatally injured, and 8 other employees were transported to area hospitals for injuries suffered during the explosion and building collapse. The explosion also ignited additional flammable material at the resin plant, resulting in a large fire that was extinguished after approximately 11 hours. After the incident, the Ohio EPA observed minor off-site impacts through at least April 11th, 2021. Yankton Majestic has estimated its total property damage from the accident at over $90 million and demolished the severely damaged resin plant after the incident. Next slide, please. Yankton Majestic, a coatings and resin manufacturer, produced resins inside batch reactors called kettles. Operators added solid and liquid raw materials into the kettles, which were continually stirred with an agitator and heated by furnaces or steam for the chemical reactions to take place. The kettles typically operated at or near atmospheric pressure. On the night of the incident, one of the kettles, Kettle 3, was nearing the end of its operating sequence. While the kettle operator had momentarily stepped out of the kettle room, Kettle 3's agitator unexpectedly shut down. Next slide, please. Next, please, yes. When the kettle operator returned, he did not realize that the agitator had shut down and proceeded to begin the cooling process and add solvent into the kettle, unaware that the solvent and hot resin were not mixing. When the operator became aware and started the agitator, the bulk of the solvent vaporized, creating a rapid pressure increase inside the kettle. Next, please. Seconds later, Kettle 3's contents began pressuring out of the sealing surface of the closed manway into the kettle room. This manway had been added 3 months prior to the incident. Next slide, please. The sequence of images shown here developed in 6 seconds, where the entire room filled with white vapor, obscuring visibility. The release also sprayed the kettle operator with hot resin that exceeded 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This operator was able to escape to safety with the help of a colleague. Next slide, please. The flammable solvent vapor spread throughout the enclosed building and formed a flammable vapor cloud both inside and outside the building in less than 2 minutes, found an ignition source, and exploded. There was no plant-wide evacuation before the explosion, and many employees were unaware of the flammable vapor cloud before it ignited. Next slide, please. The CSB determined that the cause of the fatal explosion and fire was the release of flammable solvent vapor through the seal of a closed reactor manway that was not designed, constructed, or pressure tested to a design pressure appropriate for the process. The release through the closed manway occurred after the reactor became pressurized by the rapid vaporization of solvent when the reactor's agitator was turned on. Contributing to the incident was Yankton Majestic's failure to adhere to basic pressure vessel integrity quality assurance practices, as well as the absence of clear industry guidance specifically for the design, construction, and alteration of pressure vessels in highly hazardous chemical service not exceeding 15 pounds per square inch gauge PSIG. Also contributing to the incident was the absence of engineering controls to prevent the incident sequence and the failure of the Yankton Majestic's administrative controls over reliance on operator actions. Contributing to the severity of the incident was Yankton Majestic's inadequate emergency preparedness, which led to a lack of a timely evacuation of all employees from the resin plant, lack of audible alarms to alert employees to the presence of flammable vapor concentrations in the resin plant, and a lack of flame-resistant uniforms to protect employees from fire hazards. Next slide, please. Now I turn it over to my teammate, Marianne Bogutsky, for a brief overview of the 3 safety issues discussed in the report. Next slide, please.
In our investigation, the CSB found that Yankton Majestic did not follow basic quality assurance practices that could have prevented the release from the manway. Kettle 3 normally operated at very low pressure, but was known to potentially build pressure during some upset conditions. Yankton Majestic had the manway installed 3 months before the incident and did not adequately pressure test Kettle 3. On the day of the incident, the manway did not withstand the pressure inside Kettle 3 and began releasing flammable solvent vapor once Kettle 3's internal pressure exceeded 9 psig. Next slide, please. The CSB also determined that although some pressure vessels are subject to pressure vessel safety codes, there is little industry guidance specifically for pressure vessels like Kettle 3, which normally operate at much lower pressures. As a result, Yankton Majestic believed that it was not required to implement pressure vessel safety codes on vessels like Kettle 3. Yankton Majestic's decision not to apply pressure vessel codes when altering Kettle 3 allowed the design and construction of a deficient manway that failed to contain pressure exceeding 9 psig on April 8, 2021. For example, had Yankton Majestic hired contractors certified to perform work on code pressure vessels, the manway components could have been designed, installed, and tested to contain pressure according to guidance and pressure vessel codes, and the incident could have been prevented. As a key lesson from this incident, the CSB asserts that equipment design requirements should take into account both the mechanical and the process risks when designing pressure equipment for safety. An atmospheric vessel is one that operates at the pressure of ambient air, in practice typically under 0.5 psig, and a pressure vessel is one that contains pressure. Although the American Petroleum Institute, API, and American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, standards currently exempt pressure vessels not exceeding 15 psig, vessels have the potential to build any pressure above atmospheric may still have safety implications for personnel in the vicinity, especially for equipment in highly hazardous chemical service. Next slide, please. The next safety issue in the CSB investigation report discusses safeguard selection and the hierarchy of controls. On the day of the incident, Yankton Majestic did not have engineering controls to prevent the incident sequence. While Yankton Majestic had equipped Kettle 3 with several interlocks to help allow safe operation of the kettle, Yankton Majestic did not add an interlock to prevent solvent addition to the kettle while the agitator was off during batch operations. Instead, Yankton Majestic relied on the kettle operator to recognize that Kettle 3's agitator had unexpectedly turned off, even though there were no alarms to alert him of the change. When the operator turned the agitator on, he could not reverse the action during the release. This sequence of events was a failure of administrative controls the least reliable control for preventing process safety incidents. Next slide, please. Finally, the CSB also determined that contributing to the severity of the incident was Yankin Majestic's inadequate emergency preparedness, which led to a lack of a timely evacuation of all employees from the resin plant, lack of audible alarms to alert employees to the presence of flammable vapor concentrations in the resin plant, and a lack of flame-resistant uniforms to protect employees from fire hazards. During the incident, this overall lack of hazard recognition led to some personnel approaching the hazardous gas to investigate the release instead of initiating a plant-wide evacuation. Next slide, please. Now Millie Kay will discuss the recommendations from this investigation.
Thank you. To prevent future incidents, the CSB is making a number of recommendations to Yankin Majestic and to industry groups. Next slide, please. The CSB recommends that Yankin Majestic assess and document engineering standards for all its process vessels in highly hazardous chemical service, including pressure vessels operating at low pressure, and to update its maintenance procedures and facility documentation accordingly. The CSB recommends that Yankin Majestic demonstrate their use of prevention through design in its future resin plant designs. The CSB recommends that Yankin Majestic install flammable gas detectors throughout the facility that trigger both visual and audible alarms to alert personnel of hazardous conditions and train employees on actions to take, such as prompt evacuation when such alarms are activated. In addition, the CSB recommends that Yankin Majestic require personnel to wear flame-resistant uniforms in all operating areas that process flammable chemicals. Next slide, please. The CSB is also making industry recommendations to the American Petroleum Institute, API, and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, to develop design, construction, and alteration guidance specifically for low-pressure vessels in flammable and other highly hazardous chemical service. This guidance, when it becomes available, could prevent future incidents at other companies that currently operate with highly hazardous chemicals in low-pressure equipment, like Yankin Majestic. Next slide, please. Thank you for the opportunity to present our findings. This concludes our presentation.
Well, thank you, Millie Kay and Marianne, for the presentation and your work in completing this investigation. The next investigation presentation will be on the Didion Milling incident. Cruz Redmond and Melinda Hartz will be making the presentation. Cruz Redmond served as the investigator in charge. Cruz, please proceed.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. Good afternoon. I am Cruz Redmond. I am the investigator in charge of the Didion Milling investigation. Myself, along with Melinda, will be discussing this incident. On May 31st, 2017, Didion Milling, a dry corn mill in Cambria, Wisconsin, experienced devastating combustible dust fires and explosions. All 19 employees on site at the time were impacted during the incident. There were a total of 5 fatalities, 4 serious injuries, and 10 additional injuries. Additionally, there was $15.4 million in damages and a complete loss of the facility. On the night of the incident, the facility was milling corn using a modified process in an attempt to increase production throughput. A smoldering fire began to develop inside the process equipment, and employees throughout the facility began to see and smell smoke. At approximately 11 p.m., the smoldering fire rapidly transitioned to an explosion inside the processing equipment, which in turn ruptured process equipment. The fires and explosions propagated throughout process equipment and the facility, which was also fueled by fugitive dust, causing secondary explosions, widespread damage, and multiple building collapses. The CSB identified 13 safety issues in its investigation. First, I will summarize a number of the safety issues that are often incorporated into safety management systems. Safety management systems are those processes that focus on the prevention, mitigation, and response to potential hazards in a facility such as combustible dust hazards. Didion did not have a safety management system for managing combustible dust hazards. Rather, Didion relied on its food safety programs to manage combustible dust hazards. Food safety programs are not intended for process safety considerations, but rather focus on consumer food safety. A comprehensive combustible dust safety management system incorporates reviews and assessments for hazard recognition, dust hazard analyses, fugitive dust management, management of change, incident investigations, and emergency preparedness, among other topics. The report discusses each of these safety issues related to safety management systems in greater detail.
The next safety issue is process safety leadership. The CSB found a lack of process safety leadership at Didion. The lack of adequate safety leadership contributed to a poor safety culture. 4 elements of safety leadership were identified as deficient. These 4 elements of leadership are a sense of vulnerability, understanding and acting upon hazards, deference to expertise, and combating normalization of deviance. Didion's management did not appreciate or understand the potential hazards of combustible dust in their facility. Didion's management relied on faulty calculations to incorrectly consider the combustible dust non-explosive throughout the facility. Didion was warned of the potential hazards by experts from OSHA, insurance companies, and equipment designers, but management did not act to mitigate these hazards. Finally, Didion did not combat normalization of deviance. Didion had normalized deviance regarding smoldering fires, which conditioned employees not to recognize the significance of fire inside the process equipment and its potential to transition to catastrophic dust explosions. The final safety issue is regulatory coverage of combustible dust. Combustible dust can undergo explosions, fires, and toxic emissions, severely impacting people, property, and the environment. Yet many such combustible dust materials are not regulated under OSHA safety standards. While Didion was subject to the grain handling facilities standard, this standard has not been updated since the early 1990s and does not incorporate safety management systems to mitigate combustible dust hazards. Had combustible dust been required to meet newer safety standards, Didion would have been required to implement additional risk mitigation and management systems that could have prevented this incident. The 2017 Didion incident is similar to other incidents involving combustible dust that the CSB has investigated, including the 2008 Imperial Sugar explosion. Lastly, the CSB issued a combustible dust hazard study in 2008, including a recommendation to OSHA to improve combustible dust safety by issuing a combustible dust safety standard. The CSB has investigated 5 other incidents involving combustible dust since January 2008. This recommendation has been reiterated in subsequent investigations, including this one. The recommendation has not been implemented and remains open. CSB issued recommendations to 3 groups to further improve safety. Didion Milling, the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. The CSB issued 9 recommendations to Didion to improve its process safety systems in its facility that was reconstructed in 2019. They are: develop process safety management systems, including management of change, process safety information, audits and inspection management, fugitive dust management, incident investigation, dust hazards analyses, or DHAs, engineering controls, personal protective equipment, and emergency preparedness. Implement a periodic inspection and testing program for pneumatic conveying and dust collector ductwork. Perform DHAs on all buildings and units that process combustible dust with revalidation at least every 5 years, and implement any necessary engineering controls identified in the initial and revalidation DHAs in accordance with NFPA guidance.
The CSB also recommended that Didion implement engineering controls for structural design and venting requirements of the reconstructed facility to ensure the adequacy of venting. Perform PPE hazard analyses and implement the use of flame-resistant garments for all operations that handle combustible dust during normal and upset conditions. Update its emergency response plan and employee training to incorporate NFPA guidance. Assess and update the engineering controls for adequacy to detect and alert employees of emergency situations such as smoldering fires and trigger evacuations. And lastly, develop and implement a process safety leadership and safety culture program. The CSB issued one recommendation to the NFPA, and that was to update NFPA 61 or its successor standard to include unifying DHA requirements to remove equipment exemptions, incorporating additional guidance for management of change, and updating the requirements for incident investigation programs. Lastly, the CSB made 3 recommendations to OSHA. First, superseding the previous recommendations, is to promulgate a combustible dust standard for all industries that handle combustible dust, and it should be based upon the requirements of current and future NFPA standards. Next, update the grain handling facility standard to clarify that all grain handling facilities with combustible dust are covered by this new combustible dust standard. And finally, develop a program to trigger follow-up inspections when hazard alert letters are issued for combustible dust hazards and companies do not demonstrate abatement. And this concludes our presentation on the Didion milling incident. Thank you for your time.
Bruce and Melinda, thank you very much for your work in bringing this investigation to a successful closure. This was the oldest of the group of investigations that the CSB was handling. So we very much appreciate completing this investigation. And again, thank you for your fine technical work in this case. The next investigation that we'll be hearing about this afternoon will be the Foundation Food Group investigation. Drew Solly, the investigator in charge, will be making the presentation along with chemical incident investigator Tyler Nelson. Drew, please proceed with the presentation.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Drew Solly, and I was the investigator in charge of the Foundation Food Group, or FFG, investigation. Along with me is chemical incident investigator Tyler Nelson, and today we'll provide a summary of the investigation report, which we published last December. On January 28th, 2021, liquid nitrogen overflowed from a piece of equipment called an immersion freezer at the Foundation Food Group facility in Gainesville, Georgia. The release began while maintenance workers were troubleshooting operational issues with the freezer. Once released, the liquid nitrogen quickly vaporized, expanded, and accumulated inside the freezer room, which was nearly fully enclosed, partially recessed from the rest of the facility, and which lacked mechanical ventilation. The release fatally injured the 2 maintenance workers by asphyxiation. The release and the deceased maintenance workers went unnoticed for approximately 30 to 60 minutes until another worker entered the freezer room and noticed one of the incapacitated maintenance workers alongside a 4 to 5 foot tall white vapor cloud filling the room. This worker reported the incident and management initiated a building-wide evacuation. During the evacuation, at least 14 other FFG employees, or roughly 10% of the facility workforce, entered the freezer room or the immediate vicinity, attempting to either investigate the incident or to rescue incapacitated coworkers. Of these 14 employees, 4 were fatally injured by asphyxiation, 3 were seriously injured with symptoms of asphyxia, and at least 7 others suffered minor injuries or were not injured. However, any of these employees could have been fatally injured given their proximity to the ongoing liquid nitrogen release. A responding firefighter was also seriously injured. In addition to the 6 fatalities and the 4 serious injuries, the incident also resulted in business and property losses of roughly $2 million. FFG's liquid nitrogen freezing process was designed to submerge chicken products in a bath of liquid nitrogen inside the immersion freezer. The immersion freezer had a control system that used a device called a bubbler tube to measure and control the level of liquid nitrogen in the immersion tub. If the liquid nitrogen level became too high, the control system was designed to alarm and to close 2 emergency block valves to halt the incoming flow of liquid nitrogen. Under normal operating conditions, the control system would modulate the position of a flow control valve to maintain the user-specified liquid height in the freezer. After the incident, the CSB found that the bubbler tube had been bent to the point that the freezer could no longer measure or control the level of liquid nitrogen. Because the tip of the bubbler tube had been bent above the maximum liquid level in the freezer leading up to the incident, the freezer control system measured no liquid level inside the freezer. In response, the control system would have fully opened the liquid nitrogen flow control valve. Because the tube was unable to measure any liquid level, the freezer control system continued filling the freezer until the liquid nitrogen eventually overflowed. The CSB could not determine how the tube was bent. The CSB considered several competing hypotheses, including intentional or unintentional human manipulation of the tube, or a mass of frozen product becoming wedged between the tube and the wall of the freezer, but ultimately there was insufficient evidence to definitively determine how the tube became bent. The CSB identified 5 safety issues during its investigation. The first safety issue we called single point of failure. The freezer was owned by a company called Messer and was designed by one of Messer's predecessors, Linde. Linde designed the freezer with only a single layer of protection against liquid overflow, the high-level interlock which used the bubbler tube as the sensing element. When the bubbler tube became bent, the liquid level control system could no longer measure that liquid level inside the freezer and consequently could not control the level inside the freezer either. Linde, during the freezer design phase, conducted a PHA on the freezer. Linde's PHA team failed to account for this design vulnerability and mistakenly identified the high-level interlock as a safeguard against failure of the bubbler system. This was flawed because the interlock depended on the proper function of the bubbler system. In simpler terms, Linde mistakenly identified the bubbler system as protecting itself from failure. The liquid high-level interlock could not protect against liquid overflow when the bubbler tube failed, as was the case in this incident. The second safety issue is atmospheric monitoring and alarm systems. When liquid nitrogen releases and vaporizes, it can quickly create an oxygen deficiency hazard. Because the air we normally breathe is composed of around 78% nitrogen, and nitrogen is a colorless and odorless gas, there is no way for a human to detect the presence of too much nitrogen or not enough oxygen. Victims of oxygen deficiency can lose consciousness in as few as 1 or 2 breaths if the oxygen concentration is low enough. An oxygen-deficient atmosphere can be just as dangerous as one containing flammable or toxic gas. Atmospheric monitoring systems are designed to measure the surrounding atmosphere for hazards and alert plant personnel to the presence of those hazards. They can also be designed to activate safety interlocks, shut down equipment, trigger alarms in a control room, or to activate emergency ventilation. There is an overwhelming abundance of industry guidance on the need for and use of these systems. This guidance comes from groups including the Chemical Safety Board, industry groups like the Center for Chemical Process Safety, or CCPS, trade associations like the Compressed Gas Association, or CGA, and manufacturers and distributors of hazardous gases like Messer. Despite the wealth of information and guidance on atmospheric monitoring systems, including from Messer, who owned the liquid nitrogen immersion freezer and was frequently present at FFG's facility, FFG chose not to utilize atmospheric monitoring. As a result, after the liquid nitrogen release began, at least 14 other FFG employees entered the freezer room or the surrounding area and were likely unaware of the hazardous atmosphere. Had FFG utilized these systems, responding employees could have been warned against entering the area, and the severity of the incident could have been reduced. The third safety issue is emergency preparedness. The severity of this incident was greatly increased as a result of FFG's inadequate emergency preparedness. At the policy level, FFG's policy was to simply evacuate the building during an emergency rather than for employees to respond directly. However, As stated previously, on the day of the incident, at least 14 employees responded directly to the incident scene or to the immediate surrounding area. These 14 employees included members of management who would have been responsible for implementing FFG's evacuation policy. The CSB found numerous flaws in FFG's emergency preparedness. FFG had no employees trained to respond to emergencies. Its employees had no training on how to identify a potential liquid nitrogen release. There was insufficient direction for employees not to respond to incidents, and FFG's emergency action plan and training materials were written in English when the vast majority of FFG's workforce were Spanish speakers. Additionally, the freezer system was equipped with 10 emergency shutoff buttons, or e-stops. However, all 10 of these e-stop buttons were installed in the direct vicinity of the freezer and the release point. As a result, once the release began, no one at the company could safely stop the release except by manually closing valves at the bulk liquid nitrogen storage tanks outside of the building, which only a few employees knew about. Better, safer placement of e-stop devices might have helped reduce the severity of the incident by enabling the company to stop the release sooner.
Thank you, Drew. The fourth safety issue is process safety management system. OSHA and EPA do not define liquid nitrogen as a highly hazardous chemical or extremely hazardous substance, and therefore neither OSHA's process safety management standard nor EPA's risk management program rule applies to liquid nitrogen processes, such as the freezer process at FFG. However, other process safety management frameworks are widely accepted, such as the Center for Chemical Process Safety, or CCPS's, risk-based process safety guidelines. Regardless, FFG did not have an established process safety management program to identify and control the hazards of the liquid nitrogen process. Furthermore, despite a robust industry guidance on process safety management systems, FFG was not required by law to implement it. As a result of the lack of specific regulations for cryogenic asphyxiants, FFG did not implement systems and practices that could have reduced the incident severity or prevented the accidental release altogether. The final safety issue is product stewardship. Product stewardship refers to the management practice supporting a philosophy of service to customers and minimizing effects on health and the environment throughout the complete life cycle of a product. Messer owned the bulk liquid nitrogen storage tanks and the immersion spiral freezer and leased the equipment to FFG. Messer had knowledge, experience, and policies to implement product stewardship practices. However, it applied those practices only to the bulk storage system and not to the freezer process. In addition, Messer had previously identified several issues with FFG's safety practices and nonconformance to industry guidance, including the absence of atmospheric monitoring, the absence of mechanical ventilation, the risk presented by the freezer location, and the identification of defeated interlocks on the freezer. Despite these concerns, Messer still commissioned the freezer to FFG, and he continued to supply liquid nitrogen. Using more effective product stewardship, Messer could have objected to the placement of the freezer in a room susceptible to oxygen deficiency, refused to commission its freezer equipment until FFG provided adequate atmospheric monitoring and alarm systems, suspended supply of liquid nitrogen until identified safety deficiencies had been addressed, or by ending the relationship with FFG and removing its equipment. While the owner or operator of a facility has the ultimate responsibility to implement effective practices and safeguards to manage process safety risks and to protect its workers, industrial gas suppliers are often more knowledgeable of the hazards of their products and equipment than their customers, as was the case with FFG and Messer. As such, companies like Messer should work with their customers to ensure effective safety practices are utilized, particularly when the knowledge base and experience required to do so may not be present at the customer level. As a result of this investigation, the CSB has issued 12 recommendations aimed at improving safety and preventing future incidents. Recommendation recipients include Gold Creek Foods, who is the current owner of the former FFG facility, Messer, OSHA, the Compressed Gas Association, the National Fire Protection Association, and the International Code Council. Here is a brief summary of the recommendations included in the final report. For further details, please see the report. This concludes the FFG presentation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Drew and Tyler for their work in identifying these very critical and important safety issues during the course of the investigation. The next presentation will be on the Chemco investigation conducted by the agency, and Dan Talima served as the investigator in charge, and he will be making this afternoon's presentation. Dan, please proceed.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Dan Talima. I'm a senior chemical incident investigator in my 15th year with the CSB, and today I'll be providing a summary of our investigation of the Chemco incident. As shown here, the Chemco facility was located in Crosby, Texas. On April 2nd of 2019, a cast iron Y strainer broke, releasing 10,000 pounds of isobutylene. The isobutylene formed a flammable vapor cloud, which ignited, triggering an explosion that fatally injured one Chemco employee and seriously injured 2 others. At least 28 other workers were also injured. Portions of the Chemco facility were substantially damaged from the explosion and subsequent fires. Local authorities also issued a shelter-in-place order for residents within a 1-mile radius of the facility that lasted for more than 4 hours. As a result of this incident, Chemco filed for bankruptcy and is no longer in business. This image shows a simplified drawing of Chemco's isobutylene system used to make sulfurized isobutylene. Chemco circulated isobutylene through the blue piping using the circulation pump. When isobutylene was needed in the batch reactor, the charge pump was used to direct isobutylene through the orange piping and into the reactor. The incident Y strainer is highlighted by the red oval on the inlet to the charge pump. The isobutylene piping was stainless steel, but the strainer was made from cast iron. The photo on the right shows Chemco's 70,000-gallon isobutylene storage tank. Chemco replaced its isobutylene storage tank and piping between 2014 and 2015. Under ambient pressure and temperature conditions, isobutylene is a flammable gas. Isobutylene is also an LPG or liquefied petroleum gas. At Chemco, isobutylene was shipped, stored, and used as a liquid. Next slide, Brian. Oh, you got it. The incident occurred while Chemco operations staff were making a batch of sulfurized isobutylene when a fist-sized piece of metal broke away from the body of the 3-inch cast iron Y strainer. The field operator, who was a trainee at the time, was walking nearby and immediately stopped after hearing the loud noise created when the Y strainer broke. The field operator contacted the board operator, beginning a series of urgent communications and quick actions by Chemco's operators and operations supervisors to stop the flammable isobutylene release, move other workers away from the danger, and prevent the vapor cloud from igniting. Chemco's operations staff succeeded in moving other workers out of the immediate area and preventing vehicle traffic from approaching the flammable vapor cloud. Operations team members entered the release area and manually closed valves. This stopped the flow of isobutylene, but 10,000 pounds had already been released. The operations team members also opened other valves, allowing firewater to spray throughout the batch reactor area. These actions were mostly complete when the isobutylene vapor cloud suddenly exploded while 2 operators were still within the vapor cloud and a shift supervisor was near it. The explosion fatally injured one of the operators. The other operator and the shift supervisor suffered serious burn injuries, and portions of the Chemco facility were substantially damaged from the explosion and subsequent fire. Metallurgical testing commissioned by the CSB determined that the cast iron Y strainer failure was the result of a brittle overload fracture driven by internal pressure. Brittle overload fractures can be catastrophic in that there may be no warning signs before the final fracture. Cast iron is widely recognized as a brittle material that should not have been used for an application such as Chemco's liquid isobutylene piping system. The most likely source of pressure contributing to the Y strainer failure was liquid isobutylene thermal expansion that might have periodically occurred within the charge pump's inlet piping. The image on the right is an overhead view showing the post-incident condition of Chemco's R2 building, which was a former control room that still housed electrical equipment. This building was the area of greatest explosion damage. The ignition source that triggered the isobutylene explosion was most likely located within this building. The CSB determined that the cause of the isobutylene release was a brittle overload fracture of the cast iron Y strainer, driven by internal pressure. The Y strainer was installed in a segment of the isobutylene piping that was not protected from high pressure conditions that developed within this equipment, most likely from liquid thermal expansion. The isobutylene vapor cloud was most likely ignited by equipment within a poorly sealed nearby building. Chemco's hazard evaluation programs, including process hazard analysis, pre-startup safety review, and management of change, also contributed to the incident. Chemco's hazard evaluations consistently overlooked or misunderstood that its Y strainer was made from cast iron, a brittle material that existing industry standards and good practice guidance documents either prohibit or warn against using in hazardous applications, such as the company's isobutylene system. In addition, none of Chemco's hazard evaluations identified the potential for liquid thermal expansion or other possible scenarios to develop high pressure conditions within the piping system that included the Y strainer. As a result, unlike other portions of Chemco's isobutylene piping, this piping section was not equipped with a pressure relief device to protect it from high pressure conditions. Chemco did not provide safety equipment that its workers could have used to remotely stop the isobutylene release from a safe location, which contributed to the severity of the incident. Deficiencies in Chemco's emergency response system, including its procedures and training, also contributed to the severity of the incident by not effectively distinguishing which events its operators should handle from those incidents that the site's emergency response team must respond to. Because Chemco relied on its unit operators to take quick actions to stop chemical releases, workers who were in a safe location moved toward the flammable isobutylene vapor cloud, which put them in harm's way. Chemco could have reduced the severity of the event by establishing clear policies and training its workforce to respond to a chemical release without putting themselves in harm's way. Our investigation report highlights 3 safety issues: emergency response, remote isolation, and hazard evaluation. For our discussion today, we will focus on the remote isolation safety issue. When the Y strainer ruptured, Chemco's operators lacked the safety equipment they needed to stop the release from a safe location, such as from within the blast-resistant control room. For example, had Chemco's board operator been able to close the actuated block valve installed just upstream of the Y strainer without leaving the control room, the amount of isobutylene released and the subsequent harm to workers could have been greatly reduced. Chemco had an existing recommendation from a 2010 report developed for insurance underwriting purposes that called for providing remote isolation equipment for certain flammable liquid systems, including isobutylene. Although Chemco had installed remote isolation equipment for some of these systems, the company had not addressed this recommendation for its isobutylene system. Industry knowledge about the need to provide workers with the capability to remotely isolate a major leak from a safe location dates back to at least 1969, 50 years before the isobutylene vapor cloud explosion at Chemco. But the need for remote isolation was a common safety issue among CSB's investigation of 2019 incidents, including ITC, PES, TPC, and Chemco. As a result, the CSB is planning to develop and release a safety advocacy product focused on remote isolation later in 2024. For additional information about this event, the full investigation report is available on our website. The report provides more detail and includes full analysis of the 3 safety issues, 12 findings, and 7 key lessons. This concludes my discussion of the Chemco investigation, and I will now turn it back to Executive Director Kleist.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'd also like to thank you for the professionalism that you demonstrated during the course of this investigation. The next and final presentation for this afternoon will be the Wedland 1H well incident. Butch Griffin is the investigator in charge. He, along with chemical incident investigator Jody Olson, will be making the presentation. So Butch, if you would proceed, please.
Hey, thank you, Director Kleist. On January 29th, 2020, at approximately 3 p.m., the Daniel H. Wendland 1H well, located in Burleson County, Texas, and operated by Chesapeake Operating LLC, experienced a loss of well control that resulted in a blowout of the well. Oil and gas escaped the well and within seconds found an ignition source, resulting in a flash fire in the vicinity of the well that fatally injured 3 contract workers and seriously injured another. One of the workers, who had been working close to the release point, suffered fatal burn injuries and died at the incident site. 2 others suffered serious burn injuries and later died from their injuries. A 4th worker also suffered serious burn injuries but survived. The flash fire also destroyed the workover rig and several nearby vehicles, resulting in an estimated $1 million in property damage. At the time of the incident, contract workers were in the process of installing a new tubing head as part of what is known as a workover operation. In oil and gas production operations, the term workover refers to the repair of an existing production well for the purpose of, in this case, restoring the production of oil. The workover rig crew, who were not tasked with the tubing head installation, were near the well preparing for their follow-on task of installing new tubing into the well once the tubing head installation was completed. As a result of its investigation, the CSB identified 4 key safety issues that contributed to the incident. The first safety issue identified was well planning. At the time of the incident, industry guidance stated that companies should plan for well control prior to performing workover operations. Well planning procedures from industry guidance included gathering well information, analyzing the information to predict potential hazards, and formulating contingency plans to address these hazards. Chesapeake's well control policies did not incorporate this guidance, and Chesapeake did not adequately review the past history of the Wendland 1H well, which would have indicated previous well control issues. A review of the well information conducted in accordance with industry guidance could have resulted in the preparation of well control procedures to properly isolate the hydrocarbons from the surface activity. At this time, investigator Jody Olson will discuss the second safety issue.
The second safety issue was well control for completed wells and under-pressured reservoirs. Prior to installing the new tubing head, Chesapeake's contractors pumped 50 barrels of 10-pound per gallon brine into the well with the intent of providing a hydrostatic pressure barrier against the formation. The contractors also relied on open surface valves as mechanical well control barriers. The intended well control barriers were ineffective in preventing the loss of well control and the subsequent blowout. The CSB found that industry guidance does not provide reliable well control methods for completed wells in under-pressured reservoirs. Additionally, existing regulations do not require the implementation and maintenance of well control for onshore oil and gas operations. Now Butch Griffin will discuss the final safety issues and the remainder of the investigation summary.
Thank you, Jody. The third safety issue identified is ignition source management. At the time of the incident, a mixture of flammable hydrocarbons released from the well and found an ignition source. Multiple potential ignition sources were identified in the vicinity of the open well bore. Chesapeake's policies did not incorporate industry guidance recommending that companies should perform hazard assessments when locating ignition sources and atmospheric monitors near potentially flammable atmospheres. The final safety issue identified was federal regulatory safety requirements. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, has historically exempted onshore oil and gas well drilling and servicing from its control of hazardous energy regulation at 29 CFR 1910.147, as well as its process safety management standard requirements under 29 CFR 1910.119. In addition, OSHA has not developed a separate standard to cover onshore oil and gas drilling and servicing operations, despite being a high-risk industry. As a result, there are minimal regulations that govern onshore oil and gas drilling and servicing operations, despite prior attempts to promulgate special rules for this industry. As a result of its investigation, the CSB determined that the cause of the Wendland 1H well blowout was the lack of well planning regarding the implementation of well control. Insufficient industry guidance regarding well control for completed wells and underpressured reservoirs contributed to the blowout, resulting in ineffective well control practices for these types of wells. The attempted well control barriers were ineffective, resulting in the release of hydrocarbons that ignited upon finding an ignition source. The CSB also determined that ineffective ignition source management contributed to the fire, resulting in 3 fatal injuries and 1 serious injury. The absence of regulations governing onshore oil and gas operations contributed to the incident, resulting in the failure to both effectively control hazardous energy and implement essential risk assessments that could have prevented this incident. The CSB issued a total of 4 recommendations. For Chesapeake operating, the CSB recommends that Chesapeake incorporate well planning recommendations from industry guidance, specifically including a review of well history in conjunction with workover well control planning. For the American Petroleum Institute, the CSB recommends the publication of a focused discussion on well control methods applicable to workover operations in underpressured reservoirs. Finally, the CSB calls on OSHA to not only remove the current exemption for oil and gas well servicing from its control of hazardous energy standard, but also to promulgate a new standard similar to the process safety management standard that applies to onshore oil and gas drilling, production, and well servicing activities. As a reminder, the CSB's final report is available for viewing at www.csb.gov. Thank you.
Well, Butch and Jody, thank you very much for the presentation this afternoon. We very much appreciate you identifying these very important safety issues associated with drilling operations. At this point, we've completed our presentations, and I will turn the meeting back to Chairperson Owens.
Well, thank you, Executive Director Kleist, and thanks again to all the terrific work, to all the staff for all their terrific work on these investigation reports. As Steve Kleist said in his opening comments, these were the last 5 of the reports that we had finished. We obviously had done 12 more prior to this, and every single person at the CSB contributed to getting these reports done. I will say that the work that was done on these reports was in addition to other work that they were already doing at the agency. So people were handling several different tasks at the same time. And especially Dan Talima, as Steve had indicated, who's also in charge of our accidental release reporting rule and handling the data on all of that. But there was just a tremendous amount of work that was done by everybody at the agency, but the real heavy lifting was done by the investigators to not only bring these reports to conclusion, to get those terrific reports out. And hopefully they will help reduce hazards at facilities going forward. Doesn't mean that our work is done. We still have a lot more stuff to do at the agency, but we have completed the backlog. And now we can turn our attention to going forward with new investigations. As I've also indicated at the outset, we do have some time for questions. We had not planned to have a presentation on recommendations here because we weren't sure how long the time was going to go. But as was also mentioned in these reports on the presentations on the investigation reports, we have a lot of recommendations that we've made, and as Sylvia Johnson indicated, as well as Kathy Sandoval in their opening comments, we have a lot of recommendations that have been issued in prior reports as well. So at our next public meeting, we look forward to having a presentation from our recommendations team on the status of many of the recommendations that we've issued, not only during the time that we've been working on the backlog, but in prior investigations. So we hope everybody will join us for that meeting as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now I'd like to open the floor up just briefly for a few comments. We have a policy of not responding specifically to questions. If there's information I can provide in response to comments or even questions, I will try to do so. But if you have specific questions or require more detailed information, again, please send your comments to us at public@csb.gov, and hopefully we'll be able to respond to you as quickly as we can. So with that, Brian, I know that at least one person has their hand up, and I would encourage others who have comments to please raise your hands as well so that Brian can recognize you at the appropriate time. So Brian.
Yeah, Steve, I'm keeping an eye on the list. Elizabeth Onan has her hand raised. Elizabeth, I just asked you to unmute. You should be able to unmute and leave a comment.
Yeah, and actually, Brian, before Elizabeth goes, just so I can also add that, please restate your name, and also if you're with an organization, please identify that as well, just so we can have that for our record keeping purposes. So thank you.
Elizabeth?
Thank you so much for your time, and please let me say how heroic I think your success has been, and certainly hope all these recommendations are taken very seriously. My name again is Elizabeth Onan, and I serve as a volunteer director with the Protect All Children's Environment, established in 1987 to work with people with chemical injuries. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a question per se. I guess I'd like to, if I could, put some colors in your paint box that I feel like would help, and I'll send these in to you by email as well. But I guess a monitoring device and an indication of injury that I think is not being looked at, that could be used both prior to massive problems and disasters, and as well as after, is a test that's freely available online called the Quick Environmental Exposure and Sensitivity Inventory. It is now being used in something like 14 different countries. It has been peer reviewed and published over 100 times. And I really think that this is something that should be mandated in areas where people are working, both in very dangerous or toxic areas, or in very risky workplaces. And both prior to an explosion and afterwards, to monitor injury, which can be monitored below what is commonly referred to as the dose response level. And I'll send you a tutorial on that and some contact information, if I may. One other recommendation, and this may be something you're doing already, but I think it's really important that we don't rely completely on the owners of these facilities that have oftentimes failed us, but also in the local emergency planning commission, so that any LEPC board would be aware of your findings
Well, no, and thank you, Elizabeth. Those are terrific comments. We look forward to receiving the information from you. I know throughout its history, the CSB has been very focused on the impact of these chemical incidents on the surrounding community. And that's something that certainly board members Johnson and Sandoval and I are very focused on as well. And particularly looking at the impact on children, which I know is a particular interest of yours. I've had a lot of experience in working with that in my prior lives before joining the CSB on children's environmental health issues and the effects of exposures on children. So something that we're very much aware of, and we do look forward to receiving the information from you on that. Just very quickly, with regard to your comment on LEPCs, it is something that the board has made recommendations in the past to LEPCs. But I will also just remind everybody that we are a non-regulatory agency. We don't have the authority to require anybody to do anything. Our recommendations stand on their own in terms of the persuasiveness of them, the validity of them, and the facts that support them. But we do engage with the recommendation recipients on a regular basis and work to as best we can to ensure that our recommendations are adopted by the recipients of them. So again, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here today and hope you'll join us for future meetings as well. So Brian?
Richard is up next. Richard, I've asked you to unmute when you're able to speak. Please introduce yourself and your organization.
Hello, this is Richard Mazzara. I'm basically just a private consultant. And I have a question, well, a couple of items I wanted to ask about. One was whether you're going to be posting any performance and accountability information as you have in the past for the past fiscal year. And then whether you are also going to respond in any way to the EPA Office of Inspector General review that you've had most recently. I think it was September of last year. And basically, I do want to congratulate you on your clearing up the backlog. I'm looking forward to how you're kind of reorganizing things so that you can move forward and complete investigations more expeditiously. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Well, Richard, thank you. And I know you've joined us before. We always appreciate your participation in these meetings. So again, thank you for being here and thank you for your comments. Don't want to get into a lot of the details, but just a couple of things you said. One, we will be posting the accountability, our performance accountability report, which is an annual thing that's still in the works, and that will be posted when it's completed. So that will be up there as well. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the EPA ORG report, but I do want to say that we always very much appreciate the interest of the EPA IG, who is the Inspector General for the CSB, their interest in the agency. We've worked very closely with the IG. The agency has, the CSB has over all the years of its existence, and we've continued to do that under this board. And so, whenever the IG issues a report, the particular one I believe that you're referring to, did not have recommendations. It is an annual thing that they do that just identifies issues for us to work on. And so we are in the process of doing that and then following up on some of the items that they've identified. But we always appreciate the the work being done by the Inspector General, because it's very helpful to us. And so Brian, next question. So.
Samantha, I just asked you to unmute. Please introduce yourself and the organization you're associated with, if you are.
Hello, this is Samantha Barton Fullerton. I was just wondering if I did have questions. I know that we are being told to submit to the public at csb.gov. What is the process for receiving responses if we do have questions about some of the investigation findings?
Well, there's not a formal. Hi, Samantha. I'm glad you joined us. Always good to hear from you again, and I hope you're doing well. If you have specific questions about specific reports, you can always reach out to the investigators in charge. I know you know some of them personally, and feel free to do that. Submit them in writing is always the best way, just so they'll know what your question is. But you should feel free to certainly reach out to them directly yourself, to the extent that they can respond in writing and provide the information. I know they'll try to do that. Again, if it's a particular question about a particular report. As you know from your own experience in working at the CSB, we try to make the reports as clear as we can and address as many issues as we possibly can. So, but I would encourage you just to reach out directly to the investigators in charge. If it's one of the ones here today, if you're not sure who it was that did the report, you can submit that as a question to that public at csb.gov address, and we can get to the name of who you should connect with. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Steve, next we have Matt Merton. Matt, I've asked you to unmute. Floor is yours.
It says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. Is that true?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. So I'm Matt Merton. I work for Hitachi Zosen Innova. We are in the biogas industry. I'll admit I did not know you all existed until maybe a month ago, and we've been watching your videos, which are fantastic, by the way. And we joke seriously, though, that we really don't want to be on any of your videos in the future. And so my question is, what is the boundaries of your oversight? So for example, the biogas industry is relatively new in the United States, and it is growing, and it's going to continue to grow. And so if an incident happened on a biogas site, would that be under your purview?
I think the general answer would be yes. But I would also direct you specifically to a couple of things. Well, one, our authorizing statute, which is part of the Clean Air Act. We have jurisdiction over stationary sources at which there has been an accidental release of a substance that results in a fatality, a serious injury, or substantial property damage. Those terms are not defined in the statute, but we have, as I mentioned earlier, the accidental release reporting rule, and which does define those terms, in particular serious, fatality is pretty clear, but serious injury and substantial property damage as to what those are. But also there is a guidance document that we have issued that is on our website as well. So you should take a look at that to help address any questions, because even though that's related specifically to the reporting of incidents to us under that regulation, it does provide insights into what our jurisdiction is. I should also point out that because this agency was created under the Clean Air Act, our jurisdiction is over stationary sources, so a fixed facility. If it's a mobile source, that's in other agencies, including the NTSB, with whom we work very closely. But the types of substances over which we have jurisdiction is very broad. So take a look at in particular, the reporting rule guidance document, and that'll help you understand. And if you have particular questions as well, feel free to reach out to us. I mean, perhaps Dan Tolima would be the best person who presented here on this call on the Kimco investigation. But as I mentioned, he's also in charge of the reporting rule, so he can explain some of the jurisdictional issues to you if you have any questions hereafter. So,
would you repeat his name, please?
Dan, D-A-N, Tolima, T-I-L-L-E-M-A.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you, Matt. And
Yeah, thank you,
thanks
sir.
for joining us. Thank you.
Steve, next we have John. John Bresland, you should have permission to unmute. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I did
I should think John Breslin should have permission to do anything he wants to on this call, given his rich history with the agency. So John, we really do appreciate your taking part in today's call.
Okay, thank you. Just very briefly, John Breslin, former board member and chair of the Chemical Safety Board. Just want to congratulate you on removing the backlog of investigations. That was a Herculean task, and also congratulate you on the excellence of the presentations today and the conciseness of them, but which also allowed us to understand what was going on. Just finally, good to hear from Dan Talima. I worked with Dan many years ago, and I'm very happy to hear that he's still actively involved with the Chemical Safety Board. Just one observation, and I'm not sure if this gets into the issue of personal a person's health. You talk in a general sense about serious injuries, and I know that serious injuries can mean many things, but especially in the area of burns, they can be catastrophic and not only life-threatening. And if you don't die, you're left with terrible injuries for the rest of your life. I don't know if it's appropriate to get into more detail on the extent of injuries, because I think it would give people a really good impression on the need for people to be protected from all of the incidents that you talked about today. Okay, that's all I have, and thank you very much.
Well, John, again, thank you for joining us here today, and again, thank you for all your years of service to the CSB. I know it's you're still thought of here at the agency a lot, and the role you played in moving this agency forward over the years cannot be understated. So again, thank you. Just very quickly with regard to your comment about serious injuries, as I mentioned to Matt during his question, in our reporting rule, and that you probably are familiar with this, John, it defines what constitutes a serious injury. And I know when that rule was being developed, there was a lot of discussions with stakeholders as well as here at the agency among the staff. It's generally defined as an injury that results in a hospitalization. There's some there's some fine detail associated with that. And if you go to the emergency room, for example, but are released and you don't actually have a stay at the hospital, that about what that means. But we take that very seriously as to what constitutes a serious injury, and we're always looking to see what types of injuries have taken place when there is an incident. You mentioned burns in particular. I will say, I think that most people know this out there, but if not, in December, we did deploy a team to an incident which there was a very serious burn injury. It was the Marathon refinery in Martinez, California, an individual who was very seriously injured, over 80% of his body. We're continuing to closely watch his situation as we investigate that incident. So we think about him as well as all the other people who have been injured or who lost their lives or had their property damaged in these incidents. But that is an incident where there was not a fatality, but there was a serious burn injury, and we made the decision to deploy to that. That was back in early December. So we're always thinking about that. So thank you very much, John, again, for your questions, your comments, or rather. So.
Steve, I've asked Randy Reed to unmute.
Yep.
Randy, if you could join us and share your organization and leave a comment, you have the floor.
Yes, this is Randy Reed. I'm with DECRA Process Safety, and just wanted to ask, are the presentations given today also going to be online? I would like to share some of this with some of the other consultants?
Yes, we will make those available. This is all part of the public record, and so we can have those posted, or also if you just want to send us an email with your address, we can send them to you. So
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
all right, well, thank you, Randy. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Steve, I've asked Michael to unmute and join the commenting.
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
Good. How are you, Michael?
I'm well. My name is Michael Boykin. I work for the Louisiana Chemical Association here in Louisiana. We represent over, we're a nonprofit organization, represent over 63 member companies, chemical sites with over 100 sites throughout Louisiana. We work to build a positive climate for the industry. So I would like to just say thank you all. And I want to express my sincere appreciation for your team's diligent effort just in conducting all the investigations, clearing the backlog, and providing recommendations for all the incidents. Also, I would like to say, I can assure you that the recommendations that you all do give does not go unnoticed. I run a health and safety committee meeting here, which is a lot of process engineers, health and safety professionals throughout Louisiana. And we definitely implement your suggestions here in Louisiana. So I just want to say thank you for everything that you all do.
Well, Michael, thank you, and thank you for those kind comments. We're glad to hear that our recommendations are taken seriously and that people try to implement them, even if they're not necessarily directed specifically to them. So we're always glad to hear that, and we appreciate the work that you're doing down there as well. So,
yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve, I've asked Rebecca O'Donnell to unmute.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, first I want to echo everyone else who, oh, sorry. My name is Rebecca O'Donnell with the American Chemistry Council. There we go.
Yeah.
I want to echo everyone else who's congratulated the board on the closure of the backlog of investigations. I'm sure that it was no small feat for the investigators and for the board as well. So you have mine and ACC's congratulations on that. I have two questions that I'm hoping you can shed a little light on. The first is related to the timing of other investigations. I'm wondering, with the backlog closed, if perhaps you have an average or like a goal for how long each investigation should take going forward. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, with the closure of the backlog and presumably some resources freed up, does CSB have any advocacy priorities or other projects planned for 2024 that you can shed any light on?
Let me just finish my notes here. So on your questions, but first of all, Rebecca, thank you, and also express our appreciation to your colleagues at the ACC, with whom we've worked very closely over the years. We have, we make an effort at the CSB to engage with all the stakeholders. The ACC is certainly one, but also with labor and NGOs. But we've appreciated the relationship with the ACC and the support that the ACC has given the CSB over the years, and to this board as well. So again, thank you for all of that. With regard to your two questions, one with regard to investigations, we actually have two open investigations at the moment. One is the investigation that we initiated back in September of 2022 at the BP Husky refinery in Oregon, Ohio. That's near Toledo. There were two fatalities there, unfortunately, two brothers who died, who were working at that refinery. That has been going on, as I said, since September of 2022, and we're anticipating getting the report finished on that sometime during the first half of this year. Fingers crossed. That's a bit we're being a bit unspecific on that, just because the team that has been working on that also had been working on getting some of these other investigation reports done. So, but our goal is to get that done as quickly as possible this year and during the first half of this calendar year, if at all possible. We don't have, with regard to your broader question about what we are going to do. Oh, I didn't finish otherwise. I think I mentioned the second investigation when John Breslin was was on the line with us, is the ongoing investigation that we just initiated at the Marathon Refinery in Martinez, California. That just started in December of last year, as I indicated, and so that's going to take a little while to get done. But on your broader question, we don't have a specific goal yet, if we ever will, in terms of investigations, because probably as you know from your work at the ACC, the way we work here at the CSB is, we address incidents as they arise, and we make deployment decisions based on the various factors, not the least of which is our jurisdictional issues, but also on the specifics and some of the issues that occur in those incidents to which we think we can provide some new value in terms of the kinds of recommendations or guidance that we can offer for industry to prevent such accidents from happening in the future. We are in the process, I will say, of evaluating sort of where we are now. Now that we've finished the backlog, as I said, we've got those 2 ongoing investigations. We over the last period of time since, as I mentioned, since I became the interim executive and then now the chairperson, along with Sylvia Johnson and Kathy Sandoval, we've been increasing the staffing at the agency, including particularly the investigative team. So we have more investigators than we did, certainly when Sylvia and I joined the agency back in early 2022. So we have a bit larger capacity. And so we hope that we will be able to begin deploying on a more frequent and regular basis as these incidents occur. The one last thing I'll say about that, though, not directly on topic to your question, though, is that some of this will depend on what happens with our budget. As you know, there are a lot of conversations taking place on Capitol Hill right now about potential cuts to agencies, or whether agencies will be held constant at their current funding levels. And so we are in the batch of agencies for which the continuing resolution has extended the current level of funding through March the 8th. So we are making our plans on that, continuing to try to move forward, but there is a lot of uncertainty as to what our budget is going to look like for the rest of this fiscal year. And it's hard, just to be frank, to really get a handle on what we will be able to do with whatever resources that we have until we know what those resources are going to be, because it involves not only the number of investigators that we have on board here at the CSB, and we need to add more. We're in the process of trying to hire additional investigators, but it also will depend on the other available resources for the types of expert assistance that we need during the course of investigations, whether it's for metal stress testing or blast analysis or other accident reconstruction analyses that take place as part of any of our investigations. And so as we move forward over the next few months and as things unfold in Congress with regard to our budget, we hope we'll have a better idea of what our capacity and ability is to move forward with additional and more new investigations. So again, we do appreciate everything you guys do at the ACC in terms of working with us to implement recommendations when we've made to you and to promote safety within your member companies as well. And so thanks again for you being here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. So Brian, did we wear them out?
Hands are getting tired. I don't see any at the moment. I can give it another 10 seconds here. Oh,
Uh-oh, one more. There's one, well, at least it was, it disappeared. So.
Hello.
Tricia?
Hello. My name is Tricia Hudkevich. I work with JJ Keller. I was just curious to know if now that you've closed the gap, and congratulations on that, wonderful reports, end of the year, great to see. I'm wondering if your agency would maybe return to those open recommendations and sort of close those recommendations, say with OSHA, with reactive chemicals, the oil and gas industry, combustible dust, those sorts of things. Are you thinking about pursuing those a little harder now, or are we still sitting with the investigations and all of that?
Well, thank you, Tricia, for the question, and thank you for and the comments, and thank you for being on this call. I will say, just in regard to that, as I referenced earlier, our recommendations obviously are really the heart of our efforts to promote safety at facilities and protect communities, workers, and the environment, which is part of our mission at the CSB. But the short answer to your question is yes. We always have worked very hard to encourage the recipients of the recommendations to implement them, including other federal agencies, and we are actively engaged with not just OSHA, but other agencies, EPA, as well as state and local agencies to whom we've made recommendations. We try to have periodic meetings with not just the agencies, but private sector recipients of recommendations as well, to see where they are, if there are issues that have arisen. Sometimes we found that they can't do exactly what we've recommended, but they've done something that is just as good, but a bit different. And then we will work with them to close a recommendation. But we do have a number of open recommendations at the moment. A very, very, very high percentage of the recommendations of this agency have been closed over the years. That information is posted on our website. It's up in the high 80s right now. I will say, as a result of all the reports that we've issued, the 17 reports that we issued over the last 17 months, as we've talked about here today, we have a lot more open investigations, but those are all still what we would consider to be current open recommendations because of the timelines that are involved in it. So I can assure you that we are working very diligently in terms of our outreach with recommendation recipients. We are very focused on not just closing recommendations, but being able to close them successfully, so that we can hopefully have some level of assurance that the workers who work in those facilities and the children and families who live in those facilities are being protected from any chemical incidents that may occur. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks for the comments. So with that, I know we've got a little bit over the time that we thought we would allocate for comments, but there have been a lot of great comments, and we really have appreciated everyone's interest in the CSB. I'm going to ask Sylvia and Kathy to say any closing remarks that they may have. But before I do that, I just want to remind everybody of our next upcoming public meetings. We have 2 more left in this fiscal year. The next one will be on April 25th, 2024. Then the one after that will be on July 25th, 2024. And both of those will be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then when we get closer to the next fiscal year, we'll be announcing the dates and times for the round of open public meetings, rather, in fiscal year 25 when we get into that fiscal year. So with that, Sylvia, Kathy, any last remarks?
Yes, thank you, Steve. And I just want to thank everyone for attending our meeting today. Your presence on these calls is vitally important to the mission of our agency, and we certainly value the comments and questions that we get from the public because they help us to remain focused on why we're here, which is to protect workers, community, and the environment. And again, a big thanks to the entire CSB team. As I said earlier, I'm excited about the next chapter in the life of the CSB. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and we'll see you in April.
And thank you, Board Member Johnson. And again, wanted to echo the thanks to the entire CSB team for their diligent work. And I do mean everybody on the team. It takes all of us to lift this up and produce these reports, eliminate the backlog, and follow up on the recommendations. To former Chair Breslin's question about injuries, the reports themselves contain more detail about the injuries as well as the fatalities. And sadly, the worker injuries include not only severe burn injuries, asphyxia, but also an amputation from crush injuries. So these are very serious incidents, which also resulted in millions of dollars in property damage and damage to plants. We heard repeatedly in the presentations that in many cases, plants have been advised by their insurers to take safety measures, and that the safety measures were not taken in a timely process. So it just reminds us when we look at the chemical safety infrastructure, which is part of America's critical infrastructure, of the need to make timely and appropriate investments and assessments in order to not only protect the infrastructure, but to protect the workers who work there, the communities, and the environment. So we look forward to continuing to work on all the recommendations, and we're also working to put out videos on these reports as we also look at the future. And then I would also add, we do have posted on the website some information about the CSB's priorities, and so you can find information about that. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who attended, and to everyone who also participated in the investigation process. So the interviews with the workers, the survivors, the work of the experts, it is all really important to find out what happened and to make recommendations to promote safety. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sylvia and Kathy, and thanks again to everyone who participated, and a special thanks to Steve Kleist and his team in our investigations office for the terrific work they did on the reports that you heard about today. Brian, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Well, I think that concludes today's business meeting. Thanks again for everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing everyone in April. Thank you.
All righty. Thanks so much, everybody.